Hello and welcome to Beyond Business, where we focus on the latest trends in the global economy. In this show, we're looking at the crossroads between culture, competition and power. We're asking whether the cultural influence of a country is reflected in its economic and political strength. It comes at a time when China is seen to be expanding its cultural ambitions. The Chinese government is funding hundreds of institutes across the globe. Let's take a closer look in this report.
A quiet neighbourhood in Berlin, this is the Free University. It's also home to the Confucius Institute, rubbing shoulders here with other prestigious institutions. The institute opened in 2005 and mainly gives Chinese classes. Günter Lu is an engineering student and sees her future in China.
I want to combine this with my studies and do my bachelor degree there.
This Confucius Institute is funded by the Berlin University and Beijing, and it's won 3 awards from the Chinese authorities, mainly for its cultural program. They put on exhibitions and film nights. 20 people have come to see A Touch of Zen, a classic by Wu Japan about the ideal Zen life. Calligraphy classes are also very popular. You don't only learn the beautiful script, but it's also an introduction into Chinese culture.
It would be a shame to only learn how to write the words, because you can discover so much about the history and ancient philosophy.
The Confucius Institutes are part of China's cultural expansion strategy. Still, the director here says she's free to fill her program as she sees fit, although she's well aware of the criticism.
People talk about the hard power used in war and the soft power of spreading culture. But that's always been the role of these types of institutions, whether it's the Goethe Institute, the French Institute, or the British Council.
With 350 cultural institutes worldwide, China is catching up fast, and it sees the Berlin Institute as a model for the rest.
All right, for more now on culture and competition, we can turn to Professor Marjorie Arendt-Sapphire. She's the founder and director of the Arts Arena, which is part of the American University of Paris, right here in the French capital, of course. Welcome to France 24.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here.
Now, as someone who works actively in the field of culture, do you think that culture can project a country's power, for instance, in the field of business or politics?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the obvious answer coming from someone like me. But what you just showed in terms of China suggested something special to me, which is the question of language, which is a very important part of culture. And if you're talking about business and finance, then language is extremely important. One of the great cultural exports of the Anglophone world has been its language. It's a huge advantage in the digital world, for example, and what the Chinese are doing. It's not just making people understand their culture. It also means that people learning their language are going to be able to go and work in China. It does affect their trade position. I usually think that exporting culture is always a great idea, and that one of the perfect examples comes from the country that we both live in, which is France. In the 19th century, the French absolutely exported their culture all over the world. The Alliance Française has been an extraordinary success, and I do think it changes the image of a country. When you see a country such as my own, where the exports are banking, business, sometimes war, sometimes other less desirable activities. And then you see the French, who are great exporters of arms, which is a business. But people don't think that when they think of France. They think of the great painters, they think of literature, they think of people who appreciate things. I think that it's not just soft power, but it softens the hard image of a country that otherwise might look it's just looking out for its own interest in a harder world.
Now, you speak there of soft power. In the report, we just heard it being juxtaposed to hard power, which I suppose it's military power, it's raw political power, if you will. It's to do with geopolitics. It seems as if you're saying that soft power, yes, it definitely works.
I think it does. It might not always work in the way that the government wants it to work, because one of the most important things about soft power is that it can't be government controlled. As the person said in the film, they keep a certain distance. Obviously, being Chinese representatives, they have an instinct for where they can go and where they can't go. But I think that one of the important things about soft power is indeed that it is soft, that it's not just following a hard line, because if a government backs a cultural policy that's only to its political or financial interest, it won't be successful as a cultural policy.
But when a government spends money on culture or on cultural institutes across the world, do you think that they have that issue of soft power in the back of their heads? Is it part of the calculation, for sure?
I think it's a question of terminology. Today we talk about soft power or we talk about smart power as opposed to hard power. But I think that prestige is another word for it. And certainly when the French were spreading their culture in Latin America in the 19th century, they weren't sitting there saying, this is soft power. What it was, French prestige, what we want people to think of the French. So I think it's really branding, if you want, and it's imaging. And I think that on a first degree, it might not bring in lots of contracts, business, or anything like that. But in a second degree, the way a country's perceived by other countries is a very important factor, not just in the cultural area. And that's really what it does. And also, I was mentioning earlier about some countries are really beginning to take their own culture and export it, obviously, because there economically, tourism is a very, very major factor.
I want to talk a little bit more about funding, because that is one of those issues that always come up when it comes to these cultural institutions and these cultural institutes. Before we continue our discussion, I just want to play you a clip, though, from the Chief Executive of the British Council. Let's listen in as he speaks about these issues.
One of the things that we think is very important about the cultural relations organisations is that they have to be at arm's length from government. So, for example, we have funding from the British government, but we operate at an arm's length. We have conversations about what we should do, but we do not talk with the government about how we should do our work. So that independence we think is very important. China is going to be a critically important partner for us all in the future. And we very much welcome the development of Confucius Institutes in this country. There are more Confucius Institutes in the UK than any other European country. But they still are too closely linked to the Chinese government. I think it's about the question of whether or not they reflect China in all its complexity, including criticism of their own government. In our case, I think in the case of our French colleagues, in the case of our German colleagues, we're not afraid to criticise our own governments.
All right. That was the Chief Executive of the British Council, Martin Davidson. Do you agree with him? Do these kind of cultural institutes that need to stay at an arm's length away from their governments?
I think there's no question about it. And I think the British Council does an excellent job of it. The Aspen Institute in the arts arena in 2008 did a big conference on culture and conflict, culture on the move, dealing precisely with these questions, and gave our first Cultural Diplomacy Prize to the British Council. So that, no, they absolutely have to. I think it's a question of credibility. There's that fine line between advocating your own culture or for your own culture and being a propaganda vehicle. And the minute that you're perceived as a propaganda vehicle, you're going to be a flop on a cultural level, and the entire raison d'être for your soft power isn't going to exist anymore. So I think that not only from an ethical point of view and from an artistic point of view is it important to have real credible independence, but from a realpolitik point of view, it's critical. Because if you don't have that, it's too transparent. Everybody sees it, everybody feels it, and nobody's going to go to your cultural institution anymore.
That's a fine balance, though, isn't it? Because you have funding from governments. The British Council gets money from the British government. The Alliance Française gets money from the French government, and the Goethe Institute gets money from the German government.
Yes, I think that smart governments recognize that giving money doesn't mean dictating policy to arts institutions. We're very complicated. I say we, as someone in literature, and artists in general are very complicated people, and we usually don't think we're employees of anybody. We're very independent. I have no work with a government, the arts arena works with and is part of the American University of Paris. But I think it's an analogous situation in that we are partially funded by the American University of Paris, for which we're very grateful, but we have full independence in terms of content and arts. And that's because any smart higher administration recognizes you can't do a cultural institution if you start dictating the culture.
I just wanted to ask you there about, in the interest of transparency, how the arts arena is funded. You say that part of your funding does come from the American University of Paris.
Only parts of our operational budget. I receive course releases for my directing the arts arena, and we have use of space at the American University of Paris. The rest of our funding for our programs, we don't have any funding from the university. That's where the separation is. Our programs are funded by Arts Arena membership program, by international foundations, the Florence Gould Foundation, the Danny Kaye and Sylvia Fine Kaye Foundation, the Jerome Robbins Foundation, etc., from contributions, and we do a lot of partnerships. When we partnered with the Aspen Institute, for example, there was a financial contribution from them and a content contribution from us. So that's really how we function. We're also very, very fortunate in that we've had people at the highest levels of cinema, dance, music, visual arts, etc. We don't pay honoraria. They have all volunteered to come and do an event or speak at the arts arena, which I think is a very good comment about artists in general in a very complicated world, and one of the reasons that I think that it's worth government investing in the arts.
Indeed. Marjorie Arendt-Sapphire, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us.
Thank you very much.
And with that, we're going to wrap up this edition of Beyond Business. You're watching France 24.